Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing the Sharks' ongoing rebuild. And the reason I put that word in air quotations is because it is a bit of a forbidden word around the league, as many teams will instead elect to use more veiled language and lighter language like, oh, we are retooling or we are taking a step back. And this is because those two things, those two terms / words would imply that we're just going maybe a year or two of being bad, while a full-on rebuild would imply more so like 5+ years of being bad. And it's quite obvious why a team wouldn't want to commit to that. You don't really want to tell fans that you are actively going to be trying to lose games for the foreseeable future, because it is of course very difficult to convince a fan to spend their hard-earned money to go to a game of a team that is expected to lose. Why would I go out of my way to travel to this arena, to buy the tickets, spend my money to see a team that I'm expected to lose when I could just stay home and watch it on TV for a very similar result? It is the experience of watching your team win that makes going to a game so exciting. Just the prospect of it happening, and for a rebuilding team, that prospect is not very high. And so it is the same situation here for the San Jose Sharks when they hired new general manager Mike Grier last offseason. He specifically said that the Sharks would not be rebuilding, and yet over his first season as NHL GM for the Sharks, he has traded away their two best players, Erik Karlsson and Timo Meier, which is a pretty clear indication that the Sharks aren't necessarily trying to win games going into this next season. And even though I have said that they have shown marginal improvement over this offseason, it is indeed by a very thin margin, which might show the Sharks going from 4th last in the standings in the previous year to maybe like 5th or 6th last. Still a very good draft position and still very far out of a playoff spot. Having said all that, what exactly does a rebuild entail, and what would be considered a successful rebuild? Well, if we take a look at some of the more successful teams as of late, the major part that you are looking for is to have an elite player in every single position. So we're talking an elite centerman, an elite winger, an elite defenseman, and of course an elite goaltender. Now, you do not have to hit on every single one of these marks, but if you actually manage to be the rare team who is able to do so, you will likely have a lot of success. One of the most successful teams of the last few years is of course the Tampa Bay Lightning, 2 straight Stanley Cups and then a Stanley Cup Finals lost in the 3rd year after that. And if we take a look at their team, they've got the elite center position handled with Stamkos and even Braden Point, elite winger in Nikita Kucherov, elite defenseman in Victor Hedman, and of course elite goaltender in Andrei Vasilevsky. But getting in all 4 of those positions can be kind of rare, and usually the positions that teams skim out on a bit is at goaltending. Goaltending is a very unpredictable position, and while it is very nice and a nice thing to have where you can have that consistent goaltender like a Vasilevsky or a Carey Price or a Henrik Lundqvist, these types of players, it is not 100% a necessity, and many teams in the past have shown that you can take an above average goaltender who ends up getting on a roll and finding his game in the playoffs and win with that goalie. So for instance, the Golden Knights this season did it with Adin Hill. The Colorado Avalanche last season did it with Darcy Kemper. The Pittsburgh Penguins did it a couple of years with Matt Murray. And so really your major target is to try to get that elite center, that elite winger, that elite defenseman, and then just try to find a good enough goaltender to carry you to the top. And so when it comes from a San Jose Sharks perspective, how close are they to actually landing that? They have been bad for 4 years, but they haven't really committed to the rebuild for the last couple of years, or until the last couple of years. So how many prospects have they actually accumulated that can help fill in these roles? Well, at elite center, the Sharks do have one possible candidate, and that is the 4th overall pick from this last draft, Will Smith. It is still very early to tell. We will need to see his actual draft plus 1 year before making any sort of indications, but the potential does seem to be there that he can become a very strong first liner for the San Jose Sharks in the future. Obviously doesn't have that same level of potential as a Connor Bedard who of course was the 1st overall pick to the Chicago Blackhawks this past season, but Will Smith very well might be the guy for San Jose. The elite winger position is a bit more shaky, I would say. That would be with William Eklund, drafted at 7th overall back in 2021, and when he was indeed originally drafted, it was wagered that this was a steal for the San Jose Sharks at 7th overall, and he may end up being, if not the best player, maybe top 3 player from that draft. He was definitely expected to be an effective first liner for San Jose, but in these past couple of years, that estimation has dropped slightly, still finding himself, of course, with top 6 potential, but perhaps settling in more to a second line role. And this is because he hasn't really managed to lock down a long-term spot in the NHL just yet. It is not that much of a surprise that Eklund would not get a full-time NHL spot in his draft plus 1 years. Rarely do players actually manage to do so, and in his draft plus 2 year, it's also not that out of the ordinary, but it is going to be in this draft plus 3 year, which is this upcoming season, whether or not we will see Eklund get that long-term spot, which will be sort of a turning point in what his development might amount to. If he's able to lock down that spot, he's able to put up like a 40 or 50 point season playing in these Sharks top 6 consistently, he could very well end up being that elite winger within, 2 or 3 years. But if he is unable to do so and he ends up finding himself with a long-term AHL spot, it might be slightly more worrying. Not to say that Eklund is never going to become an NHL player as a whole, but would he become an elite winger at that point? It's difficult to say, and perhaps not that much of a sure thing. And so when it comes to the forward position, the Sharks, while there is some hope, it is still slightly shaky. On the defensive side of things, well, things aren't really all that close. The Sharks do have a decent amount of defensive prospects, but none who you would really consider to have that elite sort of game-breaking Cale Makar or Adam Fox type of potential. The 2 players leading the way for the Sharks at this point are Henry Thrun and Shakir Mukhamadullin. Henry Thrun did show himself in a short stint last season to be pretty good, but probably not really a top 1 defenseman at the NHL level type of good, but maybe more so a top 4 defenseman, the kind of guy who you would find behind the Cale Makar, perhaps like the Devin Taves or the Bowen Byram style. And then with Shakir Mukhamadullin, we haven't really yet seen him at the NHL level, and yet most people seem to think that it is much more so a top 4. This is not to say that neither of these players could end up surprising us over these next couple of years, but it shouldn't be a sure thing, and the Sharks should not think that it is a sure thing. There are a couple of other outside shots like Matthias Havelid or Luca Cagnoni, who was most recently drafted in the 4th round of this past year. But like I said, those are outside shots and definitely not sure things at all. And then of course at the goaltending position, just to briefly mention that the Sharks don't really have any potential there. So you're not really expecting any sort of elite player in that role. And so when it comes to these past 4 years of the Sharks being bad, they do have some decent assets to show for it, but not nearly enough to really give any sort of confidence that this can be a competitive team. Now, going into this next season, the good news, I would say, is that unlike the 2023 draft, which was relatively weak in terms of the defensive pool, the 2024 draft is expected to be actually rather strong in terms of defensive pool. So indeed, if the Sharks do end up with a strong, high draft pick in the upcoming draft, we're talking top 5 once again, they might be able to find that elite defender. But one of the most important things when it comes to a rebuild is in locking down those players is that you do not try to come out of a rebuild too early. We have seen many teams in the past try to do this and fail, and what this ends up doing is just further extending your rebuild by many, many seasons. For instance, one of the best teams to look at for this example is the Buffalo Sabres, who have not made the playoffs much in the last 15 or so years because they went into a rebuild, came out of it way too early, tried to compete, and it didn't end up working out. And I believe they did that 2 times over this stretch of years, which has just made it so that they have been very bad for a very long time. And the Sharks would specifically want to avoid this. And so we know they're likely to be bad in this upcoming season, but let's say they do end up drafting a defenseman in the top 5. If they then try to compete in that 6th season, it might end up working out okay if all of their prospects pan out to exactly what their potential requires. But if, for instance, Eklund falls a bit short, or perhaps the defenseman that they draft in 2024 doesn't end up being that elite guy, what ends up happening is, yes, maybe the Sharks will return to a playoff spot, but will they actually be able to be competitive with the top dogs of the Western Conference and the league in general? Probably not. If we actually take a look at another team that is like this, we could actually take a look at the Los Angeles Kings, who did acquire acquire a lot of very high overall draft capital over the years that they were quite bad, but they haven't really panned out all that well. Alex Turcotte not really doing much, and Quinton Byfield still time, but not necessarily a ton of hope there either. And so while the Kings have made the playoffs these past couple of years, it doesn't seem they have what it takes to compete against, the Oilers or the Stars or the Golden Knights or these really, really top caliber teams. And so it is very possible that the Kings will float around in mediocrity over these next few years and likely have to commit to a rebuild once again in the next few years once Kopitar ends up getting aged out of the league, and the same goes with a player like Drew Doughty. The Sharks do not want to fall into this same trap, and so the top thing that it takes for a rebuild to work out is, of course, patience. It is so difficult to have this patience because pretty much everybody and their mothers is waiting for the team to pop out of the rebuild. The Sharks fans want to see the team do well, and so they're saying, okay, maybe now this year we can do well, guys, right? Like, come on, let's get back to winning. Coaches and players, of course, are in that very same boat. They want to be set up in a position to succeed because even during those rebuilding years where the team is actively trying to lose, the players themselves are definitely trying to win. And then, of course, from an ownership's perspective, you're likely pretty tired of just burning millions of dollars per year for unsuccessful seasons, and you're trying to get to that point where you can start actually getting that money rolling in from making the playoffs and things like that. So a GM needs to be extremely disciplined and extremely on the ball in exercising patience until he does indeed feel that the team is ready to actually compete within the next couple of years. And you're not necessarily expecting immediately coming out of that rebuild straight success. For instance, if we take a look indeed like the Tampa Bay Lightning, they came out of their rebuild around 2013. They had picked up first overall Steven Stamkos, second overall Victor Hedman, and it took 3 years before they actually made their first big splash in the playoffs, which was a 2015 Stanley Cup Finals loss to the Chicago Blackhawks, and then it took another 5 years after that before they actually won a Stanley Cup. So a successful rebuild won't immediately show itself literally in the next year, but if the Sharks do time this well, it's possible that within 3 years from the end of that rebuild, they can actually be one of those top dogs of the Western Conference and of the league in general. But if it is not handled correctly, we may be in for a decade of darkness. Hopefully that will not end up being the case, but we'll see how Mike Grier manages to handle it. His first year has been okay enough, some strange moves, some decent pickups, some solid trades as well, but it remains to be seen how he navigates the rest of this because it is going to be very difficult. Class dismissed.